Good morning, this is Ron, and welcome to Story Time. And welcome to another episode of Story Time. This is, Tuesday the 14th of February, and 2017. And I'm recording this on location on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena at Lovebirds Cafe and Bakery. We've got quite a few people in here, and then we've got the music going, so it's a little bit louder in the background than it usually is. So I'm again reading from the book by Ayn Rand called The Virtue of Selfishness, and from the back cover it reads, The Virtue of Selfishness. Ayn Rand here sets forth the moral principles of objectivism, the philosophy that holds man's life, the life proper, to a rational being as the standard of moral values and regards altruism as incompatible with man's nature, with the creative requirements of his survival, and with a free society. Ayn Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged, philosophically the most challenging bestseller of its time. Her first novel, We the Living, was published in 1936. With the publication of The Fountainhead in 1943, she achieved a spectacular and enduring success. Ms. Rand's unique philosophy, objectivism, has gained a worldwide audience. The fundamentals of her philosophy are set forth in 4 nonfiction books: Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, For the New Intellectual, The Virtue of Selfishness, and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. The magnificent statement of her artistic credo, The Romantic Manifesto, is also available in a Signet edition. And a couple of notes, epistemology is a branch of philosophy that studies knowledge. And also there's another book that they didn't include here, and it's called Philosophy, Who Needs It? And that would be the book I would recommend reading first. So, and what I'm going to do right today is read both chapters 7 and 8, because both of them are very short. So, first chapter is by Ayn Rand. All of the chapters in this book are basically what she did is she'd taken either articles that she had written for various newspapers, magazines, or transcripts of speeches that she made, and put them together and then edited them and put them together in a book. So some of the chapters are from speeches or whatnot that Ayn Rand did. Some of them are from a former colleague of hers named Nathaniel Brandon. So this one is Chapter 7, Doesn't Life Require Compromise, by Ayn Rand. A compromise is an adjustment of conflicting claims by mutual concessions. This means that both parties to a compromise have some valid claim and some value to offer each other, and this means that both parties agree upon some fundamental principle which serves as a base for their deal. It is only in regard to concretes or particulars, implementing a mutually accepted basic principle, that one may compromise. For instance, one may bargain with a buyer over the price one wants to receive for one's product and agree on a sum somewhere between one's demand and his offer. The mutually accepted basic principle in such case is the principle of trade, namely, that the buyer must pay the seller for his product. But if one wanted to be paid and the alleged buyer wanted to obtain one's product for nothing, no compromise, agreement, or discussion would be possible. Only the total surrender of one or the other. There can be no compromise between a property owner and a burglar. Offering the burglar a single teaspoon of one's silverware would not be a compromise, but a total surrender. The recognition of his right to one's property. What value or concession did the burglar offer in return? And once the principle of unilateral concessions is accepted as the base of a relationship by both parties, it is only a matter of time before the burglar would seize the rest. As an example of this process, observe the present foreign policy of the United States. There can be no compromise between freedom and government controls. To accept just a few controls is to surrender the principle of inalienable individual rights, and to substitute for it the principle of the government's unlimited, arbitrary power, thus delivering oneself into gradual enslavement. As an example of this process, observe the present domestic policy of the United States. There can be no compromise on basic principles or on fundamental issues. What would you regard as a compromise between life and death, or between truth and falsehood, or between reason and irrationality? Today, however, when people speak of compromise, what they mean is not a legitimate mutual concession or a trade, but precisely the betrayal of one's principles, the unilateral surrender to any groundless, irrational claim. The root of that doctrine is ethical subjectivism, which holds that a desire or a whim is an irreducible moral primary, that every man is entitled to any desire he might feel like asserting, that all desires have equal moral validity, and that the only way men can get along together is by giving in to anything and compromising with anyone. It is not hard to see who would profit and who would lose by such a doctrine. The immorality of this doctrine and the reason why the term compromise implies, in today's general usage, an act of moral treason, lies in the fact that it requires men to accept ethical subjectivism as the basic principle superseding all principles in human relationships, and to sacrifice anything as a concession to one another's whims. The question, doesn't life require compromise, is usually asked by those who fail to differentiate between a basic principle and some concrete, specific wish. Accepting a lesser job than one had wanted is not a compromise. Taking orders from one's employer on how to do the work for which one is hired is not a compromise. Failing to have a cake after one has eaten it is not a compromise. Integrity does not consist of loyalty to one's subjective whims, but of loyalty to rational principles. A compromise, in the unprincipled sense of the word, is not a breach of one's comfort, but a breach of one's convictions. A compromise does not consist of doing something one dislikes, but of doing something one knows to be evil. Accompanying one's husband or wife to a concert when one does not care for music is not a compromise. Surrendering to his or her irrational demands for social conformity, for pretended religious observance, or for generosity toward boorish in-laws is. Working for an employer who does not share one's ideas is not a compromise. Pretending to share his ideas is. Accepting a publisher's suggestions to make changes in one's manuscript when one sees the rational validity of his suggestions is not a compromise. Making such changes in order to please him or to please the public against one's own judgment and standards is. The excuse given in all such cases is that the compromise is only temporary and that one will reclaim one's integrity at some intermediate future date. But one cannot correct a husband's or wife's irrationality by giving into it and encouraging it to grow. One cannot achieve the victory of one's ideas by helping to propagate their opposite. One cannot offer a literary masterpiece when one has become rich and famous to a following one has acquired by writing trash. If one found it difficult to maintain one's loyalty to one's own convictions at the start, a succession of betrayals, which helped to augment the power of the evil one lacked the courage to fight, will not make it easier at a later date, but will make it virtually impossible. There can be no compromise on moral principles. In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. And that's a quote from Atlas Shrugged. The next time you're tempted to ask, doesn't life require compromise? Translate that question into its actual meaning. Doesn't life require the surrender of that which is true and good to that which is false and evil? The answer is that precisely is what life forbids. If one wishes to achieve anything but a stretch of tortured years spent in progressive self-destruction. And that is the end of chapter 7, and that was written in July of 1962. The next chapter, 8. How does one lead a rational life in an irrational society? By Ayn Rand. I will confine my answer to a single fundamental aspect of this question. I will name only one principle, the opposite of the idea which is so prevalent today and which is responsible for the spread of evil in the world. That principle is one must never fail to pronounce moral judgment. Nothing can corrupt and disintegrate a culture or man's character as thoroughly as does the precept of moral agnosticism. The idea that one must never pass moral judgment on others, that one must be morally tolerant of anything, that the good consists of never distinguishing good from evil. It is obvious who profits and who loses by such a precept. It is not justice or equal treatment that you grant to men when you abstain equally from praising men's virtues and from condemning men's vices. When your impartial attitude declares, in effect, that neither the good nor the evil may expect anything from you, whom do you betray and whom do you encourage? But to pronounce moral judgment is an enormous responsibility. To be a judge, one must possess an unimpeachable character. One need not be omniscient or infallible, and it is not an issue of errors of knowledge. One needs an unbreached integrity, that is, the absence of any indulgence in conscious, willful evil. Just as a judge in a court of law may err when the evidence is inconclusive, but may not evade the evidence available, nor accept bribes, nor allow any personal feeling, emotion, desire, or fear to obstruct his mind's judgment of the facts of reality. So every rational person must maintain an equally strict and solemn integrity in the courtroom within his own mind, where the responsibility is more awesome than in a public tribunal, because he, the judge, is the only one to know when he is being impeached. There is, however, a court of appeal from one's judgments, objective reality. A judge puts himself on trial every time he pronounces a verdict. It is only in today's reign of amoral cynicism, subjectivism, and hooliganism that men may imagine themselves free to utter any sort of irrational judgment and to suffer no consequences. But, in fact, a man is to be judged by the judgments he pronounces. The first thing which he condemns or extols exist in objective reality and are open to the independent appraisal of others. It is his own moral character and standards that he reveals when he blames or praises. If he condemns America and extols Soviet Russia, or if he attacks businessmen and defends juvenile delinquents, or if he denounces a great work of art and praises trash, it is the nature of his own soul that he confesses. It is their fear of this responsibility that prompts most people to adopt an attitude of indiscriminate moral neutrality. It is the fear best expressed in the precept, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." But that precept, in fact, is an abdication of moral responsibility. It is a moral blank check one gives to others in exchange for a moral blank check one expects for oneself. There is no escape from the fact that men have to make choices. So long as men have to make choices, there is no escape from moral values. So long as moral values are at stake, no moral neutrality is possible. To abstain from condemning a torturer is to become an accessory to the torture and murder of his victims. The moral principle to adopt in this issue is judge and be prepared to be judged. There it is. The opposite of moral neutrality is not a blind, arbitrary, self-righteous condemnation of any idea, action, or person that does not fit one's mood, one's memorized slogans, or one's snap judgment of the moment. Indiscriminate tolerance and indiscriminate condemnation are not two opposites. They are two variants of the same evasion. To declare that everybody is white, or everybody is black, or everybody is neither white nor black but gray is not a moral judgment, but an escape from the responsibility of moral judgment. To judge means to evaluate a given concrete by reference to an abstract principle or standard. It is not an easy task. It's not a task that can be performed automatically by one's feelings, instincts, or hunches. It is a task that requires the most precise, the most exacting, the most ruthlessly objective and rational process of thought. It is fairly easy to grasp abstract moral principles. It can be very difficult to apply them to a given situation, particularly when it involves the moral character of another person. When one pronounces moral judgment, whether in praise or in blame, one must be prepared to answer why, and to prove one's case to oneself and any rational inquirer. The policy of always pronouncing moral judgment does not mean that one must regard oneself as a missionary charged with the responsibility of saving everyone's soul, nor that one must give unsolicited moral appraisals to all those one meets. It means A, that one must know clearly in full, verbally identified form, one's own moral evaluation of every person, issue, and event with which one deals and act accordingly. B, that one must make one's moral evaluation known to others when it is rationally appropriate to do so. This last means that one need not launch into unprovoked moral denunciations or debates, but that one must speak up in situations where silence can be objectively taken to mean agreement with or sanction of evil. When one deals with irrational persons, where argument is futile, a mere "I don't agree with you" is sufficient to negate any implication of moral sanction. When one deals with better people, a full statement of one's views may be morally required. But in no case and in no situation may one permit one's own values to be attacked or denounced and keep silent. Moral values are the motive power of man's actions. By pronouncing moral judgment, one protects the clarity of one's own perceptions and the rationality of the course one chooses to pursue. It makes a difference whether one thinks that one is dealing with human errors of knowledge or with human evil. Observe how many people evade, rationalize, and drive their minds into a state of blind stupor in dread of discovering that those they deal with, their loved ones or friends or business associates or political rulers, are not merely mistaken, but evil. Observe that this dread leads them to sanction, to help, and to spread the very evil whose existence they fear to acknowledge. If people did not indulge in such abject evasions as the claim that some contemptible liar means well, that a mooching bum can't help it, that a juvenile delinquent needs love, that a criminal doesn't know any better, that a power-seeking politician is moved by patriotic concern for the public good, that communists are merely agrarian reformers, the history of the past few decades or centuries would have been different. Ask yourself why totalitarian dictatorships find it necessary to pour money and effort into propaganda for their own helpless, chained, gagged slaves who have no means of protest or defense. The answer is that even the humblest peasant or the lowest savage would rise in blind rebellion were he to realize that he is being immolated, not to some incomprehensible noble purpose, but to plain, naked, human evil. Observe also that moral neutrality necessitates a progressive sympathy for vice and a progressive antagonism to virtue. A man who struggles not to acknowledge that evil is evil, finds it increasingly dangerous a man who struggles not to acknowledge that evil is evil finds it increasingly dangerous to acknowledge that the good is the good. To him, a person of virtue is a threat that can topple all of his evasions, particularly when an issue of justice is involved, which demands that he take sides. It is then that such formulas as "nobody's ever fully right or fully wrong" and "who am I to judge" take their lethal effect. The man who begins by saying there is some good in the worst of us goes on to say there is some bad in the best of us, then there's got to be some bad in the best of us, and then it's the best of us who make life difficult. Why don't they keep silent? Who are they to judge? And then, on some gray, middle-aged morning, such a man suddenly realizes that he has betrayed all the values he had loved in his distant spring and wonders how it happened, and slams his mind shut to the answer by telling himself hastily that the fear he had felt in his worst, most shameful moments was right, and that values have no chance in this world. An irrational society is a society of moral cowards, of men paralyzed by the loss of moral standards, principles, and goals. But since men have to act, so long as they live, such a society is ready to be taken over by anyone willing to set its direction. The initiative can come from only two types of men, either from the man who is willing to assume the responsibility of asserting rational values, or from the thug who is not troubled by questions of responsibility. No matter how hard the struggle, there's only one choice that a rational man can make in the face of such an alternative. And that is the conclusion of Chapter 8, written in April of 1962. But there's so much in both of these chapters that still that really rings true today. Particularly at the end here, the initiative can come from two types of men: either the man who's willing to assume the responsibility of asserting rational values, or from the thug who's not troubled by questions of responsibility. And this reminds me of Donald Trump, President Trump, that for people that support Donald Trump, they believe, I think that the first is true, that he is the man that is willing to assume the responsibility of asserting rational values, coming out and saying that we need a border wall, that we need to redo NAFTA and TAP and things of that nature. And he has very much more, he doesn't have this gray, he's very much black and white. And then from the other side, from the people that didn't vote for Trump, they're the ones who believe that he is a thug who is not troubled by questions of responsibility. That's why they're always going on about him making up facts and insisting that he is lying and not accepting responsibilities for his actions. So it's just fascinating to me that so much of what Ayn Rand wrote 4, 5, 6 decades ago still rings true today. And again, that was chapters 7 and 8 from the book, nonfiction book written by Ayn Rand called The Virtue of Selfishness. And this concludes this episode of Storytime. And the next episode is going to be on Thursday, the 16th of February, and probably about the same time, and probably right here at Lovebirds Cafe. So thank you for joining me, and hope to see you next time.
State.